On April 27th, 2011, author George R.R. Martin posted on his live journal blog 2 words, "'Twas beauty," along with an image from the 1976 King Kong movie, with the titular character lying dead on the ground. This was Martin announcing the completion of the 5th book in the A Song of Ice and Fire series, that being A Dance with Dragons. Martin made this announcement in this way since this was a particularly difficult book for him to write, which he was very open about during the writing process. This is evident in the fact that the last book in the series, A Feast for Crows, came out in 2005, 6 years previously. Previous gaps between publications had only been about 2 years in comparison. A few months later, the book had officially published, and George had confirmed that he was already working on the next book in this series, that being The Winds of Winter. While George didn't exactly promise that Winds was going to be coming out soon, he did seem more optimistic that this book would at least come out sooner than Dance did. If you haven't noticed, we are now in the year 2025, 14 years after Dance with Dragons was first published. And The Winds of Winter still has not come out. And in this 14-year gap, the A Song of Ice and Fire fandom has been slowly losing their minds. This is because people are still invested in these books even after all of this time has passed. They are still looking forward to Winds actually coming out. There are several reasons for this being the case, one obvious reason being the Game of Thrones TV show that aired during a large portion of this gap, and there has been some supplemental material published during this period as well. There was Fire and Blood, talking about the Targaryen dynasty, the republication of the Duncan Egg novella series as a graphic novel, and the TV shows that are based off of those books. But I believe the real reason people aren't abandoning this fandom just yet and are still invested in this next book coming out, it has to do with the world within these books. The world of A Song of Ice and Fire is so intricate and so full of little mysteries that there's so much to talk about even over a decade later. Dance left us off with so many cliffhangers, some major, some minor, and these mysteries naturally lend themselves to people forming fan theories. There are some valid theories, like the ones that have a lot of evidence behind them, or ones that have pretty much been confirmed by the show. This is stuff like Jon Snow's parents being Rhaegar and Lyanna. And yes, the books are so far behind that Jon's parentage has not been confirmed yet, so yes, it's still technically a theory. And then there's the less valid theories, the ones that could only be produced after a decade of overthinking things, like Jon Snow's parents being anybody besides Rhaegar and Lyanna. There are multiple theories out there claiming that certain characters are horses. And I'm like 95% sure some of them are not jokes. Now, I haven't been in the A Song of Ice and Fire fandom for this entire gap. I didn't start reading the books until around 2019 in preparation for season 8 of Game of Thrones. God, what an innocent time that was. But that's still 6 years of me also slowly losing my mind. So, naturally, I have made some fan theories of my own, and I really need to share these theories with somebody. I need to feed the brainworms before they completely take over my mind. I'm pretty in touch with the theory space in A Song of Ice and Fire, so I'm pretty sure nobody else has come up with these, or at least I've never seen anybody talk about them before. But you know, if there's some obscure Reddit post or a YouTube video out there with only 100 views that have talked about these before, I'm sorry. I do in fact touch grass sometimes. Sue me. I will be presenting these theories as if you have at least seen Game of Thrones, the show, and I'll fill in the gaps when relevant for major differences between the show and the books. I'm sure most of y'all watching have read the books. However, my mom is going to be watching this video and I don't want her to be confused. Also, of course, I'm gonna be spoiling so much, both the show and the books, so if you haven't seen the show or read the books, and that's a thing that you care about, I'm sorry, you might as well just not watch the video. Oh, and if you are that person, I'm sorry that I spoiled who Jon Snow's parents are. Oops. Now let's hit into theory number 1. The Sphinx is the riddle, not the Riddler. In A Feast for Crows, Jon Snow, as commander of the Night's Watch, orders Samwell Tarly to leave the Wall and head to Old Town. This is so that he can study to become a maester and replace the current maester at the Wall, that being Aemon Targaryen. Several people accompany Sam on this trip, that being the wildling girl Gilly, Mance Rayder's baby named Monster, another Night's Watchman that really does not matter for this theory, and Aemon Targaryen himself. Jon specifically sends Aemon and the baby Monster for their protection, rather than actually helping Sam on his mission. Aemon being a Targaryen and Monster being the son of Mance Rayder, the king beyond the Wall, Jon is worried that Melisandre, the Wed Woman, who is currently at the Wall without Stannis, is going to burn them alive for some sort of ritual to help Stannis in his mission, since, you know, they have king's blood and all. However, Aemon does not do well on this trip, considering it is a very long boat journey, and he is 102 years old. In fact, Aemon himself hints at the fact that because he's been at the wall so long with its magical properties, that is why he has lived to 102, so honestly, him leaving the wall at all was going to be a death sentence for him. And that sadly turns out to be the case. Aemon dies on the way when they're just a few weeks out from reaching Old Town. In his last few days, Aemon is particularly deteriorated. He's feverish and confused, and he's rambling a bunch to Sam. A lot of what he says Sam doesn't understand about Dany and her dragons and the prince who was promised prophecy, the idea that there's going to be one hero that saves the world from the White Walkers and their invasion into Westeros. But there is one phrase in particular that is very different from the others. Simply, the Sphinx is the riddle, not the Riddler. This phrase in particular is very different from everything else Aemon is saying, and it's not clear to the audience specifically what he's referring to. Everything else he's said has been told to us before in previous books in the series and in spin-off books like the Dunk and Egg series, but specifically a Sphinx being a mystery has not been mentioned anywhere else before, and really hasn't been mentioned anywhere else after as well. There is already a theory out there explaining what he means by this. There is a character that is also introduced in A Feast for Crows that is nicknamed the Sphinx, this being Alaras, a novice of the Citadel that Sam later meets in Feast. Some believe that Alaras is actually a woman pretending to be a boy so that way he can study at the Citadel, since, they don't accept women. Specifically that he is actually Sorella Sand, one of the bastard daughters of Oberyn Martell and part of the Sand Snakes. There are a few clues to this, the fact that Alaras is half Dornish, the one time Oberyn Martell refers to Sorella Sand, he's saying that she is playing her game in Old Town. And of course there is the fact that Alaras is Sorella spelled backwards. It's a pretty obvious indication. I do agree with this theory, but specifically that the Sphinx is the riddle, not the Riddler, is referring to Alaras in this case. There really isn't any other Sphinxes in the story or anything that represents a Sphinx. It isn't even confirmed that Sphinxes are a real creature that has been confirmed to exist like dragons have. They're really more of a myth in the series. Sphinxes aren't really mentioned in any other meaningful way. They sometimes come up as decoration, like there's 2 giant Sphinx statues that are outside of the Citadel. And there is also one other mention of a Sphinx in the story, but I'm going to bring that up later. Keep that in mind. So no one else or no other thing can represent a Sphinx in the story, so naturally I believe Alaras is what this phrase is referring to. Unless it's something that just hasn't been mentioned in the story yet, but that's no fun. But I don't think that Alaras being Sorella is the definitive answer for this riddle. Because why is Aemon saying this? Why would Aemon Targaryen be getting visions of a random Dornish bastard? Everything else that Aemon was talking about during this feverish period was about Targaryens and about the prince that was promised. Targaryens do get a lot of visions or dragon dreams about things that are happening either way in the past, in the future, or even things that are currently happening. But similar to this, all of these visions either have to do with an immediate threat to them or other Targaryens, like Dany's the Dreamer seeing the doom of Valyria, or Dany hearing about her 3 betrayals. 2, the hatching of dragons, or 3, the Azor Ahai prophecy. Even when they see visions outside of this criteria, like some of Dany's visions in the House of the Undying, they're always either influenced by other things, like Shade of the Evening in that case, or they're other world-shattering events. How does a sand snake fit into all of this? If it was just so that Sam would trust Stellaris so that way he could meet Marwyn the Mage and send him on his way over to help Daenerys, that seems like a very lame answer. This feels like an answer to a mystery that the Game of Thrones show would make up, not Martin. Like the fact that Beric Dondarrion was resurrected 6 times was just so he could stand in a doorway once and save Arya. Just so stupid. I cannot start talking about Game of Thrones. I cannot start talking about Game of Thrones. Anyway, I think there is more going on here with this Sphinx. While I do think Alaras is Sorella, I think that Sorella is not all that she seems. Okay, yes, this is a secret Targaryen theory. I am so sorry. I am proposing that Sorella Sand is in fact not the bastard daughter of Oberyn Martell and some Summer Island woman. In fact, she is not even a bastard. She is actually Rhaenys Targaryen, first daughter of Elia Martell and Rhaegar Targaryen. Okay, hear me out. You have to admit, at the very least, it is possible. Sorella is Dornish and 19 years old, meaning she was born in 2080 or 2081 AD. Rhaenys was born in 2080 and looked very Dornish despite being half Targaryen. Cirilla does claim to be a Summer Islander, however she does have teak-toned skin, and at one point during Sam's final chapter in Feast, Alaras, in response to Sam asking how he knew that Sam was noble-born, says, "The same way you can tell I'm half Dornish," but he doesn't mention being a Summer Islander at all. This suggests that he looks much more Dornish than Summer Islander. While it is unlikely that Rhaenys would have survived the sacking of King's Landing, there is a possibility. This is evident in the fact that her brother, Aegon Targaryen, seemingly survived the sack of King's Landing and is now hiding out in Essos. Now, there is a strong possibility that this character is not actually Aegon Targaryen, but the fact that a lot of characters believe him to be, including Tyrion Lannister, a very intelligent character, supposedly, it is at least feasible in this world that this is true. Thus, it is possible for a Targaryen child to have been body swapped and snuck out of King's Landing before they were killed by Robert's forces. An argument against this fact is that Aegon was a baby and had his head smashed in, and thus is much harder to identify than a toddler. However, she was apparently stabbed a ridiculous amount of times, and when presented to Robert, she was wrapped up in a Lannister cloak along with Aegon. So while some characters say they recognize her body, I don't think anybody was getting a super close look at this kid, and even if they did, they probably couldn't recognize her that definitively through all of her injuries. And let's be real, she was a girl, and she died at the same time as the Mad King and almost all of his heirs. Politically speaking, people didn't care that much that she was dead. There's also ample opportunity for her to have been snuck out, since she was alone in her father's room during the time of the siege. As to who would have gotten her out of there, that I'm not too sure about. If Varys did swap out Aegon, I guess he could have also been the one to swap out Rhaenys. Although if he didn't actually save the baby and this Aegon is a fake, I doubt he would have gone out of his way to save her. One thing to consider is that Oberyn would obviously have to be in on it if this was true, so I could see an overarching Dornish plot being behind this. They were able to save Rhaenys over Aegon and Elia because there were more eyes on them and she was alone. Maybe. Doran Martell's uncle was actually on the Kingsguard at this time, so maybe he could have been involved in this somehow, even though he had died just before this. I'm not too sure about this one part. Let me know in the comments below if you have any ideas about this. If Alaras is Rhaenys, then that would be a perfect explanation as to why Aemon is having visions about a Sphinx. At this moment, he was concerned about Dany not having any Targaryens around to help her, since he had just found out about her having power and dragons, and was now too old and feeble to go and help her. And in this mentally vulnerable state he was in, his mind was taken advantage of by the powers that be in the A Song of Ice and Fire world, and clues were planted into his head that Daenerys is not the last Targaryen, and he was currently on his way to Old Town, where Alaras currently is, so his visions shifted in that direction. So it is at least possible that this is true, and it fits into the character of Rhaenys nicely. But what purpose does this have in the story? If Martin actually brought this character back from the dead, there would have to be more to it than just a neat twist. Maybe she could have some involvement in the Azor Ahai prophecy, maybe make a connection with Dany, even claim one of her dragons. But I have a more interesting proposition, and one that is more immediate, because there is someone else who is headed to Old Town right now. Someone else who has strange visions and is very interested in Targaryens at the moment. That's right, Euron Greyjoy. Euron is notoriously different in the show compared to his book counterpart. In the show, he's just an R-rated Jack Sparrow and is a very bog-standard villain. He wants what all the other villains want, to sit on the Iron Throne, and he goes about those goals in very typical ways. He attaches himself to Cersei, he does some boat battles, nothing too crazy there. However, Book Euron has a completely different MO. For one, he does way more terrible things, but we don't have to get into that right now. What's more important is his methods and the sort of eldritch horrors that he taps into to achieve his goals. He drugs himself on something called Shade of the Evening that gives him strange villains. He's apparently been to Valyria and brought artifacts back from there. He has some information on blood magic and is currently torturing people like Red Priests and Warlocks from Karth to get power out of it. And he currently has those priests and warlocks tied to the bows of his fleet and is headed to Old Town. He's got a lot of plans for this attack. And he also seems to understand the importance of Targaryens. It's unclear if he's had any visions about Azor Ahai or Targaryens specifically, but he has sent his brother off to go and fetch Daenerys and some of her dragons. Targaryens have magical blood, and if a man obsessed with blood magic finds out that a Targaryen is currently in the city he's headed to, that's not going to go very well for Alaras. And there is one more piece of evidence that comes from Euron's brother, Aeron Greyjoy. In a sample chapter from The Winds of Winter, Aeron is forced to drink Shade of the Evening and has some hallucinations of his own. He sees multiple things, but at one point he sees Euron blow a horn and summon a bunch of creatures to come and bow to him. This includes dragons, krakens, and sphinxes. I mean, come on. Remember, sphinxes rarely have come up before this point, and now they show up in a random vision alongside dragons and krakens, creatures that represent people that Euron is already trying to control in the form of Dany and his brothers. I mean, case closed, right? On to the next theory. Theory number 2. Time travel, teleportation, or a secret third thing. There is a very weird thing that happens in one of Tyrion's chapters in A Dance with Dragons. This is after he leaves Pentos and is currently heading down the River Rhine with a motley of people. He was sent down the river by Illyrio Mopats, the guy that originally arranged for Dany to be sold to Khal Drogo. The plan, according to him, is that this group is heading down to Volantis, where they'll meet the Sellsword group, the Golden Company. This whole group is going to gather them up and then head on over to Meereen, where Dany is, so they can lend this army to her cause. You know, because Illyrio and this group of people just believes in Dany so much. However, Tyrion soon finds out that one person on this boat, named Young Griff, is actually Aegon Targaryen, the dead son of Rhaegar and Elia that I talked so much about in the last theory. Tyrion confronts the group, mainly the guy who was posing as young Griff's dad, named Griff, who is actually a man called Jon Connington. He was once friends with Rhaegar and was obviously in love with him, but that's not really important to this theory. When Tyrion is making this confrontation, that's when the weird thing happens. They are currently traveling through a place that's called the Sorrows. It's home to a destroyed Rhoynish city that in present day a lot of people send stone men to. Stone men are the people that are suffering from grayscale that get to the point where they start losing their minds. At this exact moment, they are passing under a bridge called the Bridge of Dreams that has a bunch of stone men on top of it. They pass under it without being noticed, since stone men are mostly blind, and then continue the conversation about Aegon. But as the argument is ramping up, Tyrion starts noticing things that he's seen before. There's a sunken statue with 2 fingers jutting out of the water, and a marble staircase that juts up into nothing that he swears that he's seen before. And then they start approaching the Bridge of Dreams again, and this time does not go as well. The stone men notice them this time and attack the boat. They do all make it out of there in one piece, but there are some dire consequences to this. Aegon almost gets infected, but is saved by Tyrion and almost drowns in the process. Then Tyrion is saved by Jon Connington, but that results in Connington getting infected with grayscale, which has its own set of consequences. A lot of things happen from this attack, and it makes you wonder, what exactly happened here? Did they somehow teleport to an earlier part of the river? Are they temporarily stuck in a time loop? What sort of shenanigans is going on? Let's start off with eliminating some options, starting with the time loop. While there is some time travel in A Song of Ice and Fire, it's not this kind of time travel. There are some instances like Bran seemingly talking to his dad while in a heart tree vision, or the whole hold the door sequence, which hasn't happened in the books, only the show, but it has been confirmed that this is an event that will take place at some point. But it's all more incorporeal and mental projection than an actual physical transition. I don't think Martin would introduce this one type of time travel and then use a completely different magic system later. It's just not very consistent. As for teleportation magic, there have been 0 instances of this kind of magic. Throughout the whole series, everything we've seen from the Red Priest, to the magic beyond the wall, to multiple of the things that Dany sees in Essos, no one has demonstrated true teleportation magic. There's some illusions and tricks, but none of it's been confirmed to actually be someone teleporting from one place to another. And if it was, I'm pretty sure it would be introduced at this point, since, you know, things being far away and it taking a long time to get there is a huge part of a lot of storylines. And for it to be introduced this late in the series for just a throwaway scene, it just feels really cheap. Insert joke about the later season of Game of Thrones here. I have a more straightforward answer, and I'm actually going to visually demonstrate it for you here. Oh, important to note, I have seen this explanation for what happened before. I cannot remember where, I'm sorry. I am going to expand upon it more. I'm not clever enough to figure this out on my own, so just keep that in mind. Alright, as you can see, there's this rectangle here that's going to represent the pole boat that they're on. You can see the lines here representing the river. Now, before they actually made it to the bridge, down there, you can see that they were passing by an island. Tyrion mentioned this before, and it's home to a place called the Palace of Love. Now, here's the simple solution. They make their way downstream of the river, down this side of the island. But instead of continuing on down the river, they instead loop around the island and make their way back to the beginning. Hence why the scenery was repeating and they headed underneath the Bridge of Dreams again. Now, of course, the first question is, how did nobody notice this happening? But there is a few explanations for this. One, this again was happening during the whole Aegon confrontation, so they were very distracted at the moment. There was also a dense, heavy fog that they could barely see anything. And of course, the linearity of this river that I drew is probably not very representative. The straight path that I drew could easily have been completely curved, so that way when you actually get to the end of it, it's less obvious that you're continuing to go to the left. There are some questions that aren't answered by this explanation, though. First one being, there has to be at least one person paying attention, that being the one driving the boat. And also, they specifically state in the chapter that they are flowing downriver the entire time. They don't have their sails raised. It's literally impossible for them to go upstream at any point, and assuming this flows like a regular river, this side of the stream would also be going downstream, so how are they able to go upstream? Well, both of these questions can be answered by the same thing, the person who is driving the boat. Now, this boat is owned by a couple named Yandri and Ysilla. This boat was hired by Valyrio to take this group down the river, and this couple seems separate from the goals of everybody else. This couple is actually Dornish, and they're a part of a group of people called the Orphans of the Green Blood. Now, the Orphans of the Green Blood are people who live by a river called the Green Blood in Dorne. And they're called orphans because these Rhoynish people of Dorne used to live along the river Rhoyne back in the day. They were actually forced out about 1,000 years ago by Valyrian conquest. They were led by this Rhoynish princess called Nymeria, the person that Arya named her wolf after. She supposedly led 10,000 ships out of Rhoyne, and they eventually settled in Dorne. She married the Martell prince that was in charge at the time, and they lived happily ever after, more or less. And this couple felt such a connection to their lost home that they eventually returned to the Rhoyne. And now they have this boat business, carrying people and cargo up and down the river. Now, the person specifically driving the boat at this time is the woman of the couple, Ysilla. And Yandri is controlling one of the poles on the side of the boat, since it is a pole boat. There is another person that's part of the Aegon group that is controlling the pole on the other side of the boat, a guy named Duck. However, it is specifically said at this point that the river is so deep that their poles can't reach the bottom, so he isn't doing anything to steer the boat at all. He's just making sure that they don't crash into the side of the river. So Ysilla is controlling the boat at this time, and so when she reaches this point, she just turns the tiller and goes this way over the river. But then, of course, how are they going upstream? Well, there's an explanation for that. Now, back in the day, the Rhoynish had a group of people called water wizards, and they do what's on the tin. They control the currents of the water. They were actually so powerful that they were able to flood entire cities, and that's how they were able to hold off the Valyrians for as long as they could. Now, this was revealed in a book called The World of Ice and Fire, which is sort of a lore-heavy book talking about the history of this land. There aren't any water wizards that are mentioned in the actual present-day story. However, ever since Dany hatched her dragons, there's been a lot more magic returning to the world, so it's at least feasible that these water wizards are coming back. Now, if this person, Ysilla, a woman who is very connected to this mother Rhoyne, is gaining these sort of water magic powers in the current day, it's very easy for her to change the flow of this river so that way they could make their way to the other side of the island. There is actually one more thing that this theory explains, and that's how earlier in the book, Tyrion sees that statue with the two fingers sticking out of the water, and he sees it just before he reaches the island, and it is specifically on the starboard side of the boat. However, when he sees it again as one of the landmarks indicating that they're repeating terrain, it is on the larboard side of the boat, or the port. Now this is explained when the original loop is had, they pass by that way, and it appears on the starboard side. Then when they come back around, once they reach this point, let's say Tyrion is here on the boat, he looks off the larboard side, and then what do you know? The statue is on that side now. So we figured out a potential explanation as to how this happened, but now we need to talk about why it happened. What would compel this woman, possibly this couple, to put their ship, their passengers, and their own lives in danger? And not just any danger, a very slow and horrific way to die, slowly losing your mind as your body turns to stone. What could possibly be their motivation? There is one person on this boat that is a clear target. Aegon. He is the most high-profile person here, and it is very unlikely that he could be killed quietly. For example, take Tyrion. He could be a possible target for murder, considering all of the things that he's done, but he is a man that nobody else cares about on this boat. He could be killed and thrown off the ship, or murdered when they make it to port, and nobody would care. In fact, this kind of happens later on in the book when Tyrion is kidnapped by Jorah to be taken to Dany. They just assume that he ran off and leave it at that. Just move on with their lives. But if Aegon was disposed of in this way, it would be a much bigger deal. He is never left alone on the ship, and once they reach Volantis, they have lost their chance to get him. The only option to get rid of him if they wanted to is to get rid of everybody else at the same time, particularly the people that know how to use swords, so that way nobody could stop them. But that still leaves the question as to why they would sacrifice their own lives to get rid of this kid. There are two possibilities. One, someone hired them to do this, or two, they were acting on their own volition. The people who first come to mind that could have orchestrated this are Illyrio and Varys, since this seems like a kind of thing that they would do. But actually thinking it over, I really doubt this. Their methods are mysterious, but I really doubt that they would go through all this trouble of grooming Aegon to be ruler, getting him on this boat to go on this big trip, just to try and kill him in such an unreliable way. And I don't think they would do this for like any other reason, like, oh, Aegon needs to be in a real fight so that way men will respect and follow him. It's too risky, which is evident by the fact that his right-hand man, Jon Connington, gets infected. The only other person I can really think of would be Doran Martell. This couple is Dornish after all. Doran is currently sending off his son Quentyn to go and court Dany and ask her to marry him, and Aegon is going to do the exact same thing. So eliminating Aegon would reduce the competition, which would benefit Dorne. But this is also very unlikely. Even if Doran did find out about Aegon somehow, this is Elya's son, a family member that they are still mourning to this very day. If he found out that Aegon was alive, he would be doing everything in his power to protect him, not to kill him. I think the answer here that Ysilla was acting on her own, maybe in agreement with her husband, Yandri. I can't really think of a scenario where they put themselves so much at risk when their employer isn't even around to hold them accountable. Of course, the question again is still, why would they do this? Honestly, it's simple. It's because of who they are. I mentioned before that these two are orphans of the green blood, Dornish men who feel such a strong connection with their motherland that they still mourn it 1,000 years later. And this couple in particular was so attached to the Mother Rhoyne that they returned to it. And who cast them out 1,000 years ago? The Valyrians and their dragons. And what is being said right now as they pass beneath this bridge covered in stone men? They are finding out that Aegon, a Targaryen prince, is on his way to marry another Targaryen with 3 dragons. And I believe they are finding this out right then. There is no indication that they knew about the plan before this. They are just captains delivering their cargo. They saw, in this moment, the potential reignition of the Valyrian freehold, a new age of Valyrian conquest, and they have the power to end it, with the turn of a tiller and the current of a river. What does it matter if they die as well? What are their lives in the face of a dynasty that wiped out entire civilizations, their own civilization? How could they not at least try? On to the next theory. Theory number 3, the Red Wedding 2.0, Dylan's version. Alright, this is a big one, so buckle up. This one is based off a pretty popular theory called the Red Wedding 2.0. Have you noticed a trend in this video yet? What is the Red Wedding 2.0, you ask? I'm gonna get to it, relax. First, A quick refresher on the original Red Wedding. This was the wedding between Edmure Tully and Rosalind Frey, where King Robb Stark was betrayed by Walder Frey and Roose Bolton. With support from Tywin Lannister, the majority of the Northern Army was killed, along with King Robb himself and his mother, Catelyn Stark. This was one of the most famous events from the novels and effectively ended the Northern Rebellion within the War of the Five Kings. There are some key differences between the book and the show that I have to mention. One of note was that Robb's pregnant wife from the show, Talissa, was present at the Red Wedding and was also killed. Robb's wife in the books not only wasn't there and is still alive, but it's also a completely different person, that being Jane Westerland from the Crag, a small seat in the Westerlands. Her relationship to Robb, however, still serves the same function. They met while Robb was out on campaign, they made a connection, and despite the fact that Robb was betrothed to a Frey woman, he married Jane anyway. Either way, this was still one of the main reasons why the Red Wedding was happening in the first place. Why they decided to change her name and make her from Essos? Anyway, another important change is, of course, Lady Stoneheart. 3 days after Catelyn is killed and her body dumped in the river, she is found by the Brotherhood Without Banners. She was then revived by Beric Dondarrion through the Kiss of Life, a ritual that Thoros of Myr had performed on Beric in the past to bring him back to life. This ends with Beric dying and Catelyn coming back as the vengeful Lady Stoneheart. She becomes the new leader of the Brotherhood Without Banners, and they spend the rest of their time in these books hunting down and killing Freys and Lannisters. Now, the Red Wedding 2.0 is a popular theory regarding the fates of the remaining Freys. There is about to be a wedding between an unknown Frey woman and a man called Davin Lannister. The actual couple is not that important. What is important is the fact that this wedding is going to have a lot of Freys and Lannisters at it. This wedding is probably going to take place at Riverrun, because that is where Davin is right now and is currently under control by the Freys. Since Stoneheart has a lot of inside knowledge of Riverrun, this being her childhood home, it is theorized that the Brotherhood will use this information to infiltrate the wedding and kill everyone there, thus repeating the Red Wedding. I do not like this theory. Just, what does it add to the story? It's just Stoneheart killing more Lannisters and Freys, which she is already doing. I also think the theorized Frey civil war is a much more satisfying downfall for that house versus just them all getting killed at a wedding. There may be some moment for like Jaime or Brienne to stop this plot and become heroes, but that doesn't really add to their characters either. They're both pretty good people at this point. They don't really need to stop a wedding massacre for us to feel good about them. One interesting theory is that Arya is going to somehow be there and she's going to witness this, and this is going to be the moment where she turns away from her path of vengeance and goes back to being a Stark girl. But also, like, how the hell is she going to get there? I have, in my opinion, a much better scenario for this proposed Red Wedding. And for context, let's return to the original Red Wedding. The last couple paragraphs of Catelyn's perspective of the Red Wedding are very weird. Sure, her son, the last child that she thinks is alive and also not a Lannister prisoner, just died right in front of her. She's mourning her child and generally losing her mind, but she also has this weird dissociation with the rest of her body. She starts clawing at her face, enough to draw a significant amount of blood, but she doesn't seem to recognize that she's the one doing this to herself. She sees crows are actually the ones coming and drawing these lines in her face. The significance of this moment is hard to notice on a first reading, but what I'm getting at becomes clear when you examine a different chapter. A chapter that takes place 2 books after this event. The prologue chapter in A Dance with Dragons follows a character called Varamir Sixskins. This is a character we briefly met before. He is a very powerful skin changer that at the time of the story is bonded to 6 animals at the same time that he can skin change or warg into at will. Last we saw him was during Stannis' attack on Mance's army, where he was mentally obliterated when a hawk that he was warging into at the time was set on fire. The prologue follows him a little bit after he fled this battle, and he is not doing well. He's receiving care from this wildling woman called Thistle, but it's very clear that her efforts are not going to be very fruitful. So as he is dying, he decides to enter into his second life. This is what happens when a skin changer or warg dies. They mentally go into the animal that they're bonded with, and then they live a new life within this animal. But Varamir is not a very good person. He is willing to do things that are considered taboos by other skin changers, and by normal people as well. So instead of warging into one of his wolves when he's about to die, he instead decides to try and skin change into Thistle, the wildling woman. This goes very badly. Viramir is unable to gain control and ends up in one of his wolves anyway, and Thistle dies. But what I want to focus on is what happens when Viramir is trying to take over Thistle's body. Thistle obviously starts freaking out and starts shouting out loud for Viramir to get out of her body. Viramir feels this mental connection start to be made. However, he feels a disconnect from the rest of the body. There is a quote from this moment that says, "She raised her hands to his face." Do you see where I'm going with this yet? Most significant is the fact that Thistle claws her own eyes out. And what does Catelyn Stark do at the Red Wedding? Right after a very powerful warg dies right in front of her, she claws at her own face while feeling disconnected from the rest of her body. I am suggesting that after Robb Stark died, he attempted to skin change into the mind of his mother, and she was killed before he could leave again. So, when Catelyn was resurrected as Lady Stoneheart, a part of Robb came back with her. Now, a lot of people think that Robb actually skin changed into his direwolf Greywind at this moment, considering he says the words Greywind, and then his second life as Greywind immediately entered since Greywind was also killed during the Red Wedding. But what if Greywind was already dead at this point? We don't know the order of when they were killed. What if Robb tried to warg into his direwolf and found him already dead? Then, in a panic, he reaches for the person closest to him that he has the strongest bond with. Who else than the only member of his family that he thinks is still alive? I do have other little pieces of evidence if you're not convinced, and it's totally reasonable if you're not convinced by this. There is a scene in Feast where Stoneheart has reclaimed Robb's crown and is staring at it very intently. My first thought when I initially read this part of the book is, why is Catelyn even holding on to this thing? This is a symbol of her son's downfall, and she's not going to use it for anything else. She's not going to crown any heirs. She thinks they're all dead, or she hates them like Jon. But if Robb is in there too, it makes sense that she's having these conflicting feelings about reclaiming the crown, crowning someone else, or tossing it aside. And I do believe that it is both of them in there, not just Robb completely taking over Kat's body. We know that when someone's skin changes something, the target doesn't lose their mind entirely. They're still very much present, it's just a reduced force in the mind. And I also believe Catelyn's mind would have a bit more influence in this situation, just considering the circumstances of how weird this is. This mind melding would also explain the name change. Stoneheart couldn't really be called Catelyn or Robb, now could she? I also find it interesting that she just naturally became the leader of the Brotherhood Without Banners. Now, when Beric died, there was a power vacuum there that would have been very easily for her to take up. And of course, Catelyn was a very intelligent woman, and she was very good at getting people to follow her into situations that were not great for the people who were following her. That whole excursion of her capturing Tyrion and taking him to the Vale is very evident of that fact. But she was never like a military leader, and she doesn't have any combat experience. Now, the Brotherhood hasn't actually been like in a full-on battlefield, at least not that we've seen, but it has been at least implied that Stoneheart has led or commanded people into combat situations. And I just don't see that as something Catelyn would be able to do effectively. Robb, however, was very good at leading battles even though he was very green, and he outsmarted a lot of experienced military men like Tywin and Jaime Lannister. I just think Stoneheart's leadership style fits more in what Robb would have done rather than what Catelyn would have done. Also, this one isn't really proof, but I thought it was fun to mention. I mentioned how people believe that Robb tried to warg into Greywind because he says Greywind's name right before he died. However, in Game of Thrones, Robb, instead of saying Greywind, says Mother. Again, not real proof because that's show canon, not book canon, but I just thought it was a neat coincidence. If you still don't agree with me after all of that, that's fine. I'm not here to convince you of anything. I am just here trying to stave off the brainworms and hopefully entertain you in the process. Let's just assume all of this is true. what does this have to do with the new red wedding? There is one more piece of the puzzle that we are missing. There is someone else who is in the Riverlands right now. Someone who the Brotherhood knows is being escorted through this area right now. The camp outside of Riverend that this group has just left has a spy in their midst, in a man called Tom Sevenstrings. And we know he's a spy because through him, they were able to get back Rob's crown from that scene that I mentioned before. The person I am talking about is King Rob's widow, Jane Westerling. You're probably wondering why I mentioned her at the beginning of this theory. Well, now it's all coming together. I very much doubt that Jane is going to make it out of the Riverlands. Nobody makes it out of the Riverlands. I believe Jane is going to be captured, and she is going to be brought along by the Brotherhood to this Lannister Frey wedding that's going to happen. We know she's going to be in the prologue of the Winds of Winter. That is something confirmed by George, and I think that this capturing of her would be a way more interesting prologue chapter than her just arriving safely at the crag. I believe this Red Wedding 2.0 massacre will still play out, and most of the wedding guests are either going to be killed or flee. But once it's done, they're not going to let this wedding ceremony go to waste. Westerosi wedding vows don't traditionally include the whole "till death to us part" line, but it is sort of, implied legally that once one person of the couple dies, the other person is freed up from this marriage and can go on and marry other people. Now, if Robb truly is still inside of Lady Stoneheart and wants to be king in the North again, he's going to want to reunite with his queen and solidify their marriage. Robb will especially want to do this if Jane is pregnant, like a lot of fans are theorizing. If Jane is pregnant with Robb's child, that is the heir to the North in some people's eyes. Stoneheart would want to ensure that Jane has that baby so it can be raised to take Robb's place if she thinks that she herself is no longer worthy to have that title. Now, would this marriage to a reanimated corpse be considered legal? Probably not, but I don't think that Stoneheart is considering the logistics of the situation. If Stoneheart goes through with this could be the breaking point for the Brotherhood, which already has just terrible morale, and could have it dissolved completely. This could be the start of Stoneheart's downfall. Maybe she dies here, maybe she's later on put out of her misery by someone like Brienne or Arya, but either way, this would be the tipping point in her power. There are much more interesting ways that this can go, and it would be more than just the Brotherhood killing a bunch of people at a wedding. Well, these were my theories about A Song of Ice and Fire. What do y'all think? Let me know if you agree, or found glaring contradictions in my theories down in the comments below. Do I think any of these ideas are true? Not really, no. I mean, the island loop theory is probably the most correct answer to that mystery, but I doubt that George will even confirm what actually happened in this moment. There are plenty of other more important things for him to focus on in the future books rather than the scene. Please, George, focus on writing more important things. Please. But the fun of making A Song of Ice and Fire theories isn't them actually coming true. The fun comes from you making connections between 2 points, even if it might be a stretch, and just considering the possibilities there. It's like playing with dolls. If you enjoyed my insane ramblings, I would very much appreciate if you liked the video and subscribed to my channel to know when I am posting next. I promise my next video will come out sooner than this one did, and I hope you all join me for my next video, even if it has nothing to do with A Song of Ice and Fire. Bye!